On December 14, 2008, George W. Bush was holding one of the last press conferences of his presidency in Baghdad when this happened. In the West, this was a one-off news story that wound up being a comical blip in the political culture at the time. But in the Middle East, the incident was symbolic of a much deeper resentment that had been festering among the Arab people, causing the story to take several unexpected and completely absurd turns in the months that followed. This is the complete story of the George Bush shoe incident. The assailant was an Iraqi journalist named Muntadhar Al-Zaidi, who screamed at the president, "This is a farewell kiss, you dog!" Muntadhar was immediately tackled and dragged out of the room by the Iraqi Prime Minister's security guards. Though President Bush's press secretary had been left with a black eye from a microphone knocked over by a member of the Secret Service, he himself was uninjured. Immediately, the story made headlines around the world, with President Bush quipping, "That was a size 10 shoe he threw at me, you may want to know." President Bush was unfazed by the incident, telling reporters, quote, "So what if the guy threw a shoe at me?" He assured the audience he didn't feel threatened by the gesture, saying that it was simply what can happen in free societies. The New York Times wrote that the shoe throwing was an expression of outrage at the president's handling of the then 6-year-long Iraq War, specifically on behalf of all the widows and orphans the conflict had created. CNN reported that throwing shoes at someone was considered one of the worst insults in the Arab world, and indeed it sprouted countless copycat incidents across the globe which saw effigies of the president being pelted with shoes. It was soon learned that Muntadhar Al-Zaidi was a well-respected journalist who had covered the carnage of the Iraq War, with his reporting especially critical of the occupying American forces' treatment of Iraqi civilians. He was particularly outraged by the aftermath of the US bombing of Sadr City, giving voice to countless victims of the bombardment. Considering himself a man of principle, Muntadhar had once refused an offer from the US-funded network Al-Hurra. It turned out that Muntadhar had been briefly kidnapped by an unknown group in 2007, and had previously been held for questioning by US forces. His employer, Al-Baghdadiya TV, named one of its studios in honor of Muntadhar following his release. A journalist for an Iraqi television station owned by the Prime Minister recounted that in the aftermath of the shoe throwing, Muntadhar was dragged and beaten by the security guards until, quote, "he was crying like a woman." The shoe thrower was then detained on unspecified charges. Rather than apologize or discipline its employee, Al-Baghdadiya TV demanded his release on the grounds of freedom of speech, stating, quote, "Any procedure against Muntadhar will remind us of the behavior of the dictatorship in their violent actions, random detentions, and mass graves." Though some of the Prime Minister's colleagues apologized to President Bush at the press conference, reactions across the Arab world were overwhelmingly positive. Overnight, Muntadhar became a folk hero in the Middle East. One man called for President Bush to be hit with 100 shoes. A wealthy Saudi Arabian businessman reportedly offered $10 million to purchase the legendary shoes, and Colonel Gaddafi's daughter was said to have honored Muntadhar with a Medal of Courage. Protests against the Iraq War throughout Baghdad saw crowds waving their shoes in the air and even pelting a US convoy with them as they passed through neighborhoods, demanding the immediate release of the defiant journalist. Muntadhar was tested for drugs and alcohol, and questioned about whether he had been paid to throw the shoes. His brother learned that he had been offered free legal representation from over 100 lawyers, including the man who defended deposed Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. He told reporters that his brother's arm and ribs had been broken while in custody, and that he had been hit with the butt of a rifle by security officials tasked with watching over him. Shoe mania soon spread across Middle Eastern social media, with at least 300 Facebook groups honoring Muntadhar springing up within days of the incident. Daily News Egypt reported that there were calls to erect a statue of the man, and there were multiple flash games posted online allowing players to throw their own shoes at the president. Unpopular politicians in China and India soon had shoes thrown at them, inspired by Muntadhar's demonstration. Reporters Without Borders added their voice to those calling for the release of Muntadhar, citing the need for easing tensions between the Western and Arab world. Muntadhar was set to go before a judge on December 16th, with the head of the Iraqi Union of Lawyers acting as his counsel. Muntadhar did not dispute his charges when appearing before a judge who decided to remand him in custody as he weighed the case. If convicted of initiating an aggressive act against the head of a foreign state, he was facing anywhere from 7 to 15 years in prison. Muntadhar turned down an offer by Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez to move to his country. President Chavez, of course, was no fan of President Bush, calling him the devil on multiple occasions. Though the Al-Zaidi family was grateful for the offer, they insisted that they wanted to remain Iraqi no matter what the outcome. For his part, President Bush held no hard feelings over the shoe throwing, laughing it off as one of the more bizarre moments of his presidency. The incident was labored over in the Iraqi parliament, with some supporters of Muntadhar calling for government intervention to secure his release. The argument became so rambunctious that the Speaker of Parliament resigned over the chaos it created. Meanwhile, an Egyptian man offered Muntadhar his 20-year-old daughter's hand in marriage upon learning of his defiant stunt. The daughter, who is said to be on board with the idea, told reporters she fancied the idea of being paired up with the man she called a hero. A businessman from Bahrain was reportedly so taken with Muntadhar's courage that he offered him the keys to a Mercedes limousine. At the same time, multiple cobblers from across the Middle East tried claiming they were the creator of the shoes thrown at President Bush, trying to capitalize off their infamy. One Turkish company claiming to be the shoemaker saw orders swell by over 300,000 and was looking at renaming that particular model the Bush shoe. Despite this, Muntadhar's brother said they were manufactured by a local shoemaker in Baghdad. It was learned that the shoes thrown at President Bush were destroyed by Secret Service agents, who were concerned they were concealing a bomb. Fox News reported that Muntadhar wrote a letter to the Iraqi Prime Minister seeking a pardon for his behavior, expressing his regret for what he called a, quote, ugly act. His brother disputed the legitimacy of the letter, though, saying Muntadhar was not one to apologize. Farda News believed the letter to be real, but stated that the apology was only directed at the Iraqi Prime Minister, writing that Muntadhar held no remorse for throwing his shoes at the American president and that given the chance, he'd do it again. The ripple effect of the incident continued to be felt worldwide even days later, with Malaysia's foreign minister calling it an excellent show of retribution against the president and North Korea's state-run newspaper saying he deserved it. Al Jazeera reported that Muntadhar had been tortured while in captivity and that his whereabouts 4 days after the incident remained unknown, renewing calls from the public for a safe release. Though initially scheduled for December 31st, Muntadhar's trial was postponed while courts mulled over reducing his charges to simply insulting a foreign leader. Meanwhile, Muntadhar found supporters in America who were also petitioning for his release, like activists from the anti-war advocacy group Code Pink. Despite reports of being beaten in prison, China Daily wrote that correction officers held a birthday party for Muntadhar while he was detained. His brother said that a cake had been specially prepared for the man who had by now become a source of Iraqi pride over his protest. Support for Muntadhar only grew as his trial date drew closer, with a giant bronze statue of a shoe being erected outside an orphanage in Tikrit. The children who helped build the statue were said to have lost their parents during the US invasion of Iraq, with the sculptor labeling them, quote, victims of Bush's war. The BBC reported that this didn't sit well with local authorities, however, who demanded its removal just days later. The trial began in mid-February, with the shoe thrower petitioning the court for clemency. Muntadhar said that the sight of President Bush joking around with the Iraqi Prime Minister made him fly into an uncontrollable rage as he thought about the carnage brought on during the Iraq War, leading him to throw the shoes. His lawyers believed that the trial would be a test of Iraq's new democracy, and sought to have the charges either lessened or dropped. Muntadhar's entrance into the court caused his relatives to burst into applause, with one handing him an Iraqi flag which he then kissed and draped across his shoulders. Muntadhar refuted the idea that the shoe-throwing incident was premeditated, saying earlier admissions were made after he was tortured with electric shocks. Rather, he insisted that his demonstration came on in the heat of the moment. His lawyer told the judge that throwing the shoe was a case of freedom of expression, arguing, quote, we know that shoes do not harm or kill. The legal team asked to have the charge of assault dropped down to insulting a foreign head of state, which would lessen his sentence to just 2 years plus a fine. The Christian Science Monitor wrote that the court was trying to determine whether or not President Bush's visit was an official one, with that distinction being important to determine Muntadhar's charges. It was decided that Muntadhar's act did constitute assaulting a foreign head of state during an official visit, to which he pled not guilty. He was handed a 3-year prison sentence, outraging his supporters across Iraq. The judge apparently offered the more lenient sentence given Muntadhar's age and clean criminal record prior to the incident. Still, his family members saw the sentence as politically motivated, calling the Iraqi Prime Minister an agent of the Americans. Prime Minister al-Maliki told Australian media that the man was lucky to have not been executed, as would have been the case in Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Muntadhar's sentence was reduced to just 1 year in prison following an appeal. He was released after 9 months behind bars. Supporters gathered in his apartment complex shouting, "Long live the shoes," and recited poems as Muntadhar made his way home, and several sheep were said to have been sacrificed in his honor. The TV station he worked for eagerly welcomed him back to his old position. Despite the harsh treatment he endured following the incident, Muntadhar had no regrets and told Iraqi media his goal was to have President Bush put on trial at The Hague for crimes against humanity. While giving a press conference in Paris following his release, a pro-American Iraqi man threw his own shoes at Muntadhar. The original incident was later parodied in Colombia in an advertisement for a cleaning detergent, which saw Muntadhar throwing flowers at the president instead. He even got a book deal out of the affair, which told his side of the story leading up to the shoe throwing. The book was eventually adapted into a play in India. By 2010, Muntadhar had moved to Beirut, where he had worked for a Lebanese television station as a consultant. The BBC wrote that he eventually left the media industry to establish a humanitarian organization for Iraqi war victims in Europe. Muntadhar eventually returned to Iraq in 2018 to run for the country's parliament on a platform of ending corruption. In particular, he was disgusted with the state of his country in the 15 years since Saddam Hussein's ousting, blaming the politicians in charge for allowing fraud to run rampant. Despite his celebrity status, Muntadhar failed to secure the votes needed and lost that election. As of 2023, he remains unrepentant for throwing his shoes at President Bush, and has vowed to continue fighting government corruption on behalf of all Iraqis.
Who throws a shoe? Honestly.